Part 12. Progress is the mode of man. The general life of the human race is called progress. The collective advance of the human race is called progress. Progress marches, it makes the great human and terrestrial journey toward the celestial and the divine. It has its halts where it rallies the belated flock. It has its stations where it mediates, in sight of some splendid Canaan suddenly unveiling its horizon. It has its nights when it sleeps, and is one of the bitter anxieties of the thinker to see the shadow upon the human soul, and to feel in the darkness progress asleep, without being able to waken it. He who despairs is wrong. Progress infallibly awakens, and, in short, we might say that it advances even in sleep, for it has grown. When we see it standing again, we find it taller. To be always peaceful belongs to progress no more than to the river. Raise no obstruction, cast in no rock. The obstacle makes water foam and humanity seethe. Hence troubles. But after these troubles, we recognize that there has been some ground gained. Until order, which is nothing more nor less than universal peace, be established, until harmony and unity reign, progress will have revolutions for stations. What then is progress? We have just said, the permanent life of the peoples. Now, it sometimes happens that the momentary life of individuals offers resistance to the eternal life of the human race. Hence, at certain periods, a deep chill upon the magnanimous vanguard of the human race. Utopia, moreover, we must admit, departs from its radiant sphere in making war. The truth of tomorrow, she borrows her process, battle, from the lie of yesterday. She, the future, acts like the past. She, the pure idea, becomes an act of force. This reservation made, and made in all severity, it is impossible for us not to admire, whether they succeed or not, the glorious combatants of the future, the professors of Utopia. Even when they fail, they are venerable, and it is perhaps in failure that they have the greater majesty. Victory, when it is according to progress, deserves the applause of the peoples, but a heroic defeat deserves their compassion. One is magnificent, the other is sublime. For ourselves, who prefer martyrdom to success, John Brown is greater than Washington, and Piscan is greater than Garibaldi. Surely, some must be on the side of the vanquished. Men are unjust towards the great essayists of the future when they fail. Even when fallen, especially when fallen, Auguste-They, who upon all points of the world, with eyes fixed on France, struggle for the great work with the inflexible logic of the ideal. They give their life a pure gift for progress. They accomplish the will of Providence. They perform a religious act, at the appointed hour, with as much disinterestedness as an actor who reaches his cue. Obedient to the divine scenario, they enter into the tomb. On this hopeless combat, and this stoical disappearance, they accept to lead its splendid and supreme universal consequences, the magnificent movement of man, irresistibly commenced on the 14th of July, 1789. These soldiers are priests. The French Revolution is an act of God. These passages at arms for progress often fail. The throng is restive under the sway of the paladins. The heavy masses, the multitudes, fragile on account of their very weight, dread uncertainties, and there is uncertainty in the ideal. Moreover, let it not be forgotten, interests are there, little friendly to the ideal and the emotional. Sometimes the stomach paralyzes the heart. The grandeur and the beauty of France are that she cares less for the belly than other peoples. She knots the rope about her loins more easily. She is the first awake, last asleep. She goes in advance. She is a pioneer. That is because she is an artist. The ideal is nothing more nor less than the culminating point of logic, even as the beautiful is nothing more nor less than the summit of the true. The artist people is thus the consistent people. To love beauty is to see light. This is why the torch of Europe, that is to say civilization, was first borne by Greece, who passed it to Italy, who passed it to France. Divine pioneer peoples. Vitae lampada tradunt. A word more before returning to the conflict. A battle like this, which I am now describing, is nothing but a convulsive movement toward the ideal. Unfettered progress is sickly, and it has these tragic epilepsies. This disease of progress, civil war, we have had to encounter upon our own passage. It is one of the fatal phases, at once act and interlude, of this drama, the pivot of which is a social outcast, and the true title of which is progress. Progress. This cry, which we often raise, is our whole thought, and at the present point of this drama, the idea that it contains having still more than one ordeal to undergo, it is permitted as perhaps, if not to lift the veil from it, at least to let the light shine clearly through. The book which the reader has now before his eyes is from one end to the other, in its whole and in its details, Whatever may be the intermissions, the exceptions, or the defaults, the march from evil to good, from injustice to justice, from the false to the true, from night to day, from appetite to conscience, from rottenness to life, from brutality to duty, from hell to heaven, from nothingness to God. Starting point matter, the goal the soul. Hydra at the beginning, angel at the end. Part 13. Suddenly, the drum beat the charge. The attack was a hurricane. A powerful column of infantry of the line, intersected at equal intervals by National Guards and Municipal Guards on foot, and supported by deep masses, heard but unseen, turned into the street at a quick step, drums beating, trumpets sounding, bayonets fixed, sappers at their head, and unswerving under the projectiles, came straight upon the barricade, with the weight of a bronze column upon a wall. The wall held well. The insurgents fired impetuously. The barricade scaled was like a main of flashes. The assault was so sudden that for a moment it was overflowed by assailants. But it shook off the soldiers as the lion does the dogs, and it was covered with besiegers only as a cliff is with foam, to reappear a moment afterward, steep, black, and formidable. Enjolras was at one end of the barricade, and Marius at the other. Enjolras, who carried the whole barricade in his head, reserved and sheltered himself. 3 soldiers fell one after the other under his battlement, without even having perceived him. Marius fought without shelter. He took no aim. He stood with more than half his body above the summit of the redoubt. There is no wilder prodigal than a miser who takes the bit in his teeth. There is no man more fearful in actions than a dreamer. Marius was terrible and pensive. He was in the battle as in a dream. One would have said a phantom firing a musket. There was assault after assault. The horror continued to increase. Then resounded over this pile of paving stones, in this Rue de la Chanvrerie, a struggle worthy of the walls of Troy. These men, wan, tattered, and exhausted, who had not eaten for 24 hours, who had not slept, and who had but a few more shots to fire, who felt their pockets empty of cartridges, nearly all wounded, their heads or arms bound with smutty and blackened cloths, with holes in their coats whence the blood was flowing, scarcely armed with worthless muskets and with old hacked swords, became Titans. The barricade was 10 times approached, assaulted, scaled, and never taken. They fought breast to breast, foot to foot, with pistols, with sabres, with fists, at a distance, close at hand, from above, from below, from everywhere, from the roofs of the house, from the windows of the wine shop, from the gratings of the cellars into which some had slipped. They were 1 against 60. The facade of Corinth, half demolished, was hideous. The window, riddled with grape, had lost glass and sash, and was now nothing but a shapeless hole, confusedly blocked with paving stones. Bossuet was killed. Foy was killed. Courfeyrac was killed. Joly was killed. Combeferre, pierced by 3 bayonet thrusts in the breast, just as he was lifting a wounded soldier, had only time to look to heaven and expired. Marius, still fighting, was so hacked with wounds, particularly about his head, that the countenance was lost in blood, and you would have said that he had his face covered with a red handkerchief. Enjolras alone was untouched. Part 14. When there were none of the chiefs alive save Enjolras and Marius, who were at the extremities of the barricade, the centre, which Courfeyrac, Joly, Bossuet, Foy, and Combeferre had so long sustained, gave way. The artillery, without making a practicable breach, had deeply indented the centre of the redoubt. There, the summit of the wall had disappeared under the balls, and had tumbled down, and the rubbish which had fallen, sometimes on the interior, sometimes on the exterior, had finally made, as it was heaped up on either side of the wall, a kind of talus, both on the inside and on the outside. The exterior talus offered an inclined plane for attack. A final assault was now attempted, and this assault succeeded. The mass, bristling with bayonets, and hurled at a double quick-step, came on irresistible, and the dense battle front of the attacking column appeared in the smoke at the top of the escarpment. This time it was finished. The group of insurgents who defended the centre fell back pell-mell. Then grim love of life was roused in some. Covered by the aim of that forest of muskets, several were now unwilling to die. This is a moment when the instinct of self-preservation raises a howl, and the animal reappears in the man. They were pushed back to the high 6-story house which formed the rear of the redoubt. This house might be safety. This house was barricaded and, as it were, walled in from top to bottom. Before the troops of the line would be in the interior of the redoubt, there was time for a door to open and shut. A flash was enough for that. And the door of this house, suddenly half opened and closed again immediately, to these despairing men was life. In the rear of this house, there were streets, possible flight, space. They began to strike this door with the butts of their muskets and with kicks. calling, shouting, begging, wringing their hands. Nobody opened. From the window on the third story, the Death's Head looked at them. Enjolras was now in the little interior court of the redoubt, with his back to the house of Corinth, his sword in one hand, his carbine in the other, keeping the door of the wine shop open while he barred it against the assailants. He cried to the despairing, "There is but one door open, this one!" And covering them with his body, alone facing a battalion, he made them pass in behind him. All rushed in. For an instant it was horrible, the soldiers struggling to get in, the insurgents struggling to close the door. The door was closed with such violence that, in shutting it into its frame, it exposed, cut off, and adhered to the casement the thumb and fingers of a soldier who had caught hold of it. Marius remained without. A ball had broken his shoulder blade. He felt that he was fainting and that he was falling. At that moment, his eyes already closed, he experienced the shock of a vigorous hand seizing him, and his fainting fit, in which he lost consciousness, left him hardly enough time for this thought, mingled with the last memory of Cosette. "I am taken prisoner. I shall be shot." When the door was barricaded, Enjolras said to the rest, "Let us sell ourselves dearly." The barricade had struggled like a gate of Thebes. The wine shop struggled like a house of Saragossa. Nothing was wanting to the storming of the Hucheloup wine shop, neither the paving stones raining from the window and the roof upon the besiegers, and exasperating the soldiers by their horrible mangling, nor the shots from the cellars and the garret windows, nor fury of attack, nor rage of defence, nor finally, when the door yielded, the frenzied madness of the extermination. The assailants, on rushing into the wine shop, their feet entangled in the panels of the door, which were beaten in and scattered over the floor, found no combatant there. The spiral stairway, which had been cut down with the axe, lay in the middle of the basement room. A few wounded had just expired. All who were not killed were in the first story, and there, through the hole in the ceiling, which had been the entrance for the stairway, a terrific firing broke out. It was the last of the cartridges. The edge of the hole in the ceiling was very soon surrounded with the heads of the dead, from which flowed long red and reeking lines. The uproar was inexpressible. A stifled and burning smoke made night almost over this combat. Words fail to express horror when it reaches this degree. There were men no longer in this now infernal conflict. They were no longer giants against colossi. It resembled Milton and Dante rather than Homer. Demons attacked, spectres resisted. It was the heroism of monsters. Part 15. At last, mounting on each other's shoulders, helping themselves by the skeleton of the staircase, climbing up the walls hanging from the ceiling, cutting to pieces at the very edge of the hatchway, the last to resist, some 20 of the besiegers, soldiers, National Guards, municipal guards, pell-mell, most disfigured by wounds in the face of this terrible ascent, blinded with blood, furious, became savages, made an eruption into the room of the first story. There was now but a single man there on his feet, Enjolras. Without cartridges, without sword, he had now in his hand only the barrel of his carbine, the stock of which he had broken over the heads of those who were entering. He had put the billiard table between the assailants and himself. He had retreated to the corner of the room, and there, with proud eye, haughty head, and that stump of a weapon in his grasp, he was still so formidable that a large space was left around him. A cry arose. "This is the chief! It's he who killed the artilleryman! As he's put himself there, it's a good place. Let him stay. Let us shoot him on the spot." "Shoot me," said Enjolras. And throwing away the stump of his carbine, and folding his arms, he presented his breast. 12 men formed in platoon in the corner opposite Enjolras, and made their muskets ready in silence. Then a sergeant cried, "Take aim!" Within a few seconds, Grantaire had awakened. Grantaire, it will be remembered, had been asleep since the day previous in the upper room of the wine shop, sitting in a chair, leaning heavily forward on a table. Noise does not waken a drunkard. Silence wakens him. This peculiarity has been observed more than once. The fall of everything about him augmented Grantaire's oblivion. Destruction was a lullaby to him. The kind of halt in the tumult before Enjolras was a shock to his heavy sleep. It was the effect of a wagon, at a gallop, stopping short. The sleepers aroused by it. Grantaire rose up with a start, stretched his arms, rubbed his eyes, looked, gaped, and understood. Retired as he was in a corner, and, as it were, sheltered behind the billiard table, the soldiers, their eyes upon Enjolras, had not even noticed Grantaire, and the sergeant was preparing to repeat the order, "Take aim!" when suddenly they heard a powerful voice cry out beside them, "Vive la République! I belong to it!" Grantaire had arisen. The immense glare of the whole combat, which he had missed and in which he had not been, appeared in the flashing eye of the transfigured drunkard. He repeated "Vive la République," crossed the room with a firm step, and took his place before the muskets, but beside Enjolras. "Two at one shot," said he, and turning toward Enjolras gently, he said to him, "Will you permit it?" Enjolras grasped his hand with a smile. The smile was not finished when the report was heard. Enjolras, pierced by 8 balls, remained backed against the walls, as if the balls had nailed him there. He only bowed his head. Grantaire, struck down, fell at his feet. A few moments afterward, the soldiers dislodged the last insurgents who had taken refuge in the top of the house. They fired through a wooden lattice into the garret. They fought in the attics. They threw the bodies out of the windows. Some living, 2 voltigeurs, who were trying to raise the shattered omnibus, were killed by 2 shots from a carbine fired from the dormer windows. A man in a blouse was pitched out headlong, with a bayonet thrust in his belly, and his death rattle was finished upon the ground. A soldier and an insurgent slipped together on the slope of the tiled roof, and would not let go of each other, and fell, clasped in a wild embrace. Similar struggle in the cellar. Cries, shots, savage stamping, then silence. The barricade was taken. The soldiers commenced the search of the houses round about and the pursuit of the fugitives. Part 16. Marius was, in fact, a prisoner of Jean Valjean. The hand which had seized him from behind at the moment he was falling, and the grasp of which he had felt in losing consciousness, was the hand of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean, in the thick cloud of the combat, did not appear to see Marius. The fact is, that he did not take his eyes from him. When a shot struck down Marius, Jean Valjean bounded with the agility of a tiger, dropped upon him as upon a prey, and carried him away. The whirlwind of the attack at that instant concentrated so fiercely upon Enjolras and the door of the wine shop that nobody saw Jean Valjean cross the unpaved field of the barricade, holding the senseless Marius in his arms, and disappear behind the corner of the house of Corinth. It will be remembered that this corner was a sort of cape on the street. It sheltered from balls and grape, and from sight also, a few square feet of ground. Thus, there is sometimes in conflagrations a room which does not burn, in the most furious seas, beyond a promontory, or, at the end of a cul-de-sac of shoals, a placid little haven. It was in this recess of the interior trapezium of the barricade that Éponine had died. There Jean Valjean stopped. He let Marius slide to the ground, set his back to the wall, and cast his eyes about him. The situation was appalling. Before him he had that deaf and implacable house of 6 stories, which seemed inhabited only by the dead man, leaning over his window. On his right he had the low barricade, which closed the Petite Truanderie. To clamber over this obstacle appeared easy, but above the crest of the wall a range of bayonet points could be seen. A company of the line was posted beyond this barricade on the watch. At his left he had the field of combat. Death was behind the corner of the wall. What should he do? A bird alone could have extricated himself from that place, and he must decide upon the spot, find an expedient, adopt his course. They were fighting a few steps from him. By good luck, all were fiercely intent upon a single point, the door of the wine shop. But let one soldier, a single one, conceive the idea of turning the house, of attacking it in flank, and it was all over. Jean Valjean looked at the house in front of him. He looked at the barricade by the side of him. Then he looked upon the ground, with the violence of the last extremity, in desperation, and as if he would made a hole in it with his eyes. Beneath his persistent look, something vaguely tangible in such an agony outlined itself and took form at his feet, as if there were a power in the eye to develop the thing desired. He perceived a few steps from him, at the foot of the little wall, under some fallen paving stones which partly hid it, an iron grating laid flat and level with the ground. This grating, made of strong transverse bars, was about 2 feet square. The stone frame which held it had been torn up, and it was, as it were, unset. Through the bars a glimpse could be caught of an obscure opening, something like the flue of a chimney, or the main of a cistern. Jean Valjean sprang forward. His old science of escape mounted to his brain like a flash. To remove the stones, to lift the grating, to load Marius, who was inert as a dead body, upon his shoulders, to descend with that burden upon his back, by the aid of his elbows and knees, into this kind of well, fortunately not very deep, to let fall over his head the heavy iron trapdoor upon which the stones were shaken back again, to find a foothold upon flagged surface 10 feet below the ground. This was executed, like what is done in delirium, with the strength of a giant and the rapidity of an eagle. It required but very few moments. Jean Valjean found himself, with Marius still senseless, in a sort of long underground passage. There, deep peace, absolute silence, night. The impression which he had formerly felt in falling from the street into the convent fell back into him. Only what he was carrying now away was not Cosette, it was Marius. He could hardly hear above him, like a vague murmur, the fearful tumult of the wine shop taken by assault.